Hi, welcome to Frank Vero Designs, and the first episode in my new series, Work From Home Builds, where we're going to walk through some different jobs, school scenarios, that type of thing, and talk about the builds I would build for you to be able to work from home the best way you can. Get the best bang for your buck. So today we're going to talk about a career I know quite a bit about, landscape architecture. That's what I do. It's also what my wife does. So we're going to actually talk about the build I made for my wife this June for working from home, which is where I got the idea for this whole thing. So I'm going to be talking about multiple different types of landscape architects so that you can use that information to get the information you need while you're waiting for me to respond to your comment asking me to talk about your job. So down below, if you're a photographer, say, hey, I'm a photographer. What kind of computer do I need? Leave me a comment, and then I'll know to do a video about that down the road. But for now, sit back. We'll go through how I built my wife's machine. If you don't know what any of these numbers mean that I start throwing out, go watch my other playlist of my first series, Hardware Demystified, where I walk through each part of a computer, what it does, and what numbers you need to care about for what you do. But now let's talk about this landscape architecture build. Let's get into it. The first thing to know about landscape architecture, as I mentioned, is there's a lot of different types of roles in landscape architecture. People are just project managers. Some people are CAD monkeys, where they just do AutoCAD and that type of production work for blueprints. Other people do a lot of graphic work in Photoshop, 3D modeling, and other people do a blend of all of that. So I'm going to quickly walk through what the typical computer parts each one of those might need, because then my wife's computer is a blend build. So then we'll go through what I actually picked for her. For a project manager, you're talking about using mostly things like the Microsoft Office suite, lots of Word, lots of Excel, Outlook, some editing PDFs with Acrobat, but nothing super heavy. Maybe a little bit of light Photoshop or InDesign for some presentation work. But for the most part, you're doing a lot of paperwork, a lot of filing, that type of thing. For that, something that's low number of cores for a CPU, but with okay speed is really all you need. You don't need a ton of horsepower. You don't need a ton of memory. 4 gigs of RAM is probably enough, but 8 might be a little safer, especially if you do multitasking, which you can end up doing as different tasks pile up on you. You don't really need a graphics card. You could probably get away with integrated graphics. Or if you get a graphics card, you could get a very entry-level one. For storage, that's where it gets a little more interesting. You might want to make sure you actually have a redundant hard drive set up. So you may want it whether it's setting it up so you can see your previous version, so it backs up like every month or every week, so that if you accidentally have a file eat itself, you can go back to last week's version of that file and pull it back. But also you may want redundancy so that if a hard drive fails or a solid state drive, whatever, you have another one as a backup, because you don't want to lose key paperwork and not have it backed up somewhere. Along with that, you may look at having an actual separate server on-site or off-site. And I would recommend also doing, whether or not you have that server, doing a backup program that's online like Backblaze or something like that, so that you have off-site backup that just kind of is constantly going, so that as you're working, your files are backed up. So even if your computer imploded, you would be able to get a new computer and get your files back and only be missing like files from the last hour once you get them all back. That type of backup system is really important if your business relies on what you're storing on your hard drives. Then if you move to someone who's doing that CAD type of work, whether it's AutoCAD, MicroStation, whatever, your single core speed is the most important. You don't really need multi-core because AutoCAD and those types of drafting programs most of the time can only use a single core at a time, just because of how the math works on drawing the lines around. They can't draw this line here while another part is drawing this line here. Relative to that, it just doesn't work. Single core speed is key. Multi-core only becomes important in, again, that multitasking stuff. But something with 4 cores is probably enough if what you're mainly doing is AutoCAD. Your RAM gets a little more important if you work with really large or detailed files or use lots of XREFs. You probably want more 16 gigs of RAM than 8 gigs of RAM. I would say 8 is minimum. If you work with huge files, you might want to go with 32, but CAD by itself isn't likely to tip you into there. Storage space, you'll want some decently quick storage and maybe a larger backup storage device for your archive files so that you don't change something and then realize a month later you have to undo it, but you didn't back up the file. And you'll need a graphics card. You don't need a super intense one. AutoCAD says it can use up to a P2000 Quadro, is I think what they said the latest. The advantage to a Quadro card is it's a workstation card. It has error correcting memory. So if you're doing something like running simulations to make sure that your bridge won't collapse, then it's really important to use that to make sure that you're not saying the bridge won't collapse, but it's actually because a bit flipped somewhere. So you want to have that error correcting memory. If you're doing something like landscape architecture where you're drafting, you're not doing those simulations, those type of errors are much less critical. So you can use a consumer level card. The closest equivalent from NVIDIA to their Quadro P2000 is the GeForce 1660, which is about a $230 card as of when I built this. And that should be more than enough. And you could go lower. That's just where you'll stop seeing any additional benefit. So you could easily do a 1650 or something lower than that. That's more like $150 to still get you a ton of the benefit of having a graphics card, having hardware acceleration, but not spending an arm and a leg for it. Also, if you're running simulations, then you want to look at more RAM, better processor, error correcting RAM too. So that puts it in a little bit of a different class. So these are the people who are running Photoshop if they're doing 2D work. Photoshop multi-core actually becomes a little more important. Photoshop has certain filters, at least, that can use up to 8 cores at a time to help speed up the processing of it. Single core speed is a little more important still because it's more intensive. And graphics card is more important. So this is where you, I think, want to look more towards that 1660 and up range. But I think a 2060 is about where you start to cap out on benefits in Photoshop. And you also probably want to be looking around the 16 gig RAM area. For really big files, you might want to look actually at 32 gigs. But yeah, that gets a little more horsepower intensive. The other side of the graphics work is if you do 3D graphics using things like Blender and SketchUp. Those, when you're doing the work, it runs more like AutoCAD, where it's single core, fast speed is the most important part. Where that changes is once you decide to output a graphic. So in SketchUp, if you export a JPEG, or in Blender, if you render, sometimes more CPU cores will be notably quicker. You have to kind of balance how you use SketchUp and Blender if you have a render farm somewhere else where you do the modeling in Blender and then send it to a different computer to actually render out. If you're doing that, single core is most important. If you're rendering on your computer and you have really big complex renderings with a lot of materials, you'll probably want to make sure you have multi-core so it can handle all of that and get you those renders done, less than overnight. Oh, and you'll need a good graphics card for that rendering as well, and for while you're doing the drawings. And again, 1660 is kind of that sweet spot where you'll see some benefits going up to 2060 or even beyond if you're using something like Blender. But it's really that rendering path where things ramp up to being multi-core and where bigger graphics cards give you more bang for the buck. And then you have blended workflow where you do some of everything. We do everything from putting our presentations together for our design concepts, doing the AutoCAD to make the blueprints, making all the presentations and graphics and 3D models ourselves, doing them on our own computers, and then at the back end, doing the project management of the construction. So we kind of actually have to do everything soup to nuts. I do a little more of the 3D modeling side than my wife does, so I didn't lean as hard into that. Let's take a look at what build I put together for her. So for my wife's build, I started with the processor. I went with the Ryzen 5 3600. This is Generation 3 Ryzen. I went with AMD because their multi-core performance is so good. It's so strong and efficient. This is a 6-core processor. Its boost clock is 4.2. Its base clock is 3.6. So it's quick and snappy. And it has the multi-core for when she's not only doing SketchUp and Photoshop, but there's times when we end up doing AutoCAD, SketchUp, Photoshop, and having Chrome windows open for reference material all at the same time. So having those extra cores is going to be really key and important, especially when you're on a deadline, which is when having it bogged down on you is the worst. For memory, we went with G.Skill Trident Z. This is a 16 gig kit of 3600 megahertz RAM. 16 gigs will let her handle pretty sizable files in Photoshop, InDesign, whatever. And it's quick and snappy, so she won't start seeing those programs bottleneck. For the graphics card, I went slightly higher end than I probably needed to for what she uses. I used the GeForce 1660 Super with the dual fans. And the reason I went with that is she probably easily could have done the 1660 base for what she uses, but I also knew my computer was on the verge of dying, so I might need to use hers for my work at any moment. So I gave her a little bit of a boost up to the Super. Just gives her a little bit of extra headroom, and we'll also probably make it work in that rig for her for a couple extra years. Then for storage, we went with two things. There's a 2 terabyte Seagate Barracuda 7200 hard drive. That's the main storage space. That's where her archive is. That's where most of her files live. And then I have an NVMe drive it's PCIe 3, and it is only 250 gig though. So this is where her programs and her operating system live. If she's doing some big project where she needs a lot of quick back and forth, we could always move something from the hard drive onto this if it's an especially big file, so it won't fit in the RAM easily. But realistically, that's not going to be a huge issue. We also were careful to, when I installed this on the motherboard, her motherboard has one PCIe 4 slot and one PCIe 3 slot for NVMEs. So I put this in the 3 slot. The 4 slot is open. So that down the road, if we want to get her a terabyte PCIe 4, because for some reason that becomes more crucial and that bandwidth starts to become more useful, we could add that storage in there. We also have lots of room to install other SSDs down the road for a little bit quicker storage, or more traditional hard drives if we want to add more bulk storage capacity as well. And the motherboard, we went with the B550. This is an MATX, so it's slightly smaller. Still has 4 sticks of RAM, those 2 NVMe slots, and a couple of PCIe slots as well. And this also gives her good flexibility. It has the PCIe 4 support, but it's not the X570 that AMD could also use. That would be kind of overkill. This is probably slightly overkill for her, but again, gives her lots of flexibility to add more things, more RAM, better storage solutions down the road. For power supply, I went with a Corsair 550 watt. It is bronze, it's 80 plus bronze, which is important because in general, if it's not bronze or above, it's possible there could be some slightly dodgy components in here. So I would recommend always looking for bronze or up when you're getting a power supply. But in terms of that 1660 Super and the 3600, both of those are efficient enough pieces of hardware that you're not going to see that take more than 550 watts. It'll be running nicely at that 80% most of the time. Really efficient, really cool. That's the other reason on the graphics card I went with the dual fan, is to keep the graphics card nice and cool. And related to that, for the case, I went with the Fractal Meshify C in white. I went with the white because as designers, we want something that looks nice. For some people, that might be a black box that'll just kind of disappear. For other people, they might want something that's a little bit showy. We went a little more on that end, something that looks nice and interesting, but not like a spaceship landed on your desk. So this has the nice white with a charcoal front grille that looks really nice. I'm saying nice a lot. My wife really likes charcoal as accent colors in design sometimes, so that worked perfectly. You can also get this case. You can get replacement covers in different colors if you want. The other thing I did is got some additional fans from Fractal that look really great. They're RGB, so that it'll run even cooler. The great thing about the Meshify is that front panel is all mesh. The top is all mesh as well, so you get a lot of airflow to keep your components really cool, which will help them run faster. It'll also keep your computer a little quieter, especially if you add some additional fans to it, because then the fans can spin slower. Everything stays cool, fast, and should last a little bit longer as well because it's less stress on the hardware. The other thing is they light up. So you can, if you want, you can turn them off and it can go in stealth mode, kind of like my computer is right now. Or you could turn it on just flat white if you want, have it go crazy rainbow. Or what we generally have it running, her graphics card has a little blue to magenta gradient light on it. So we generally have the fans all doing that same gradient rotation and the RAM doing that as well. So it all just color coordinates and pulls together really nicely. It's just, it's something that you do end up paying extra for, between the RAM being a little more expensive, the fans being a little more expensive, the case to do that, like having the glass panel, is a little more expensive. But it's something that if you care about, you care about. So the total budget ended up being about $1,250. That included a new 24-inch 1080p monitor, a new keyboard and mouse, I believe, as well. And we easily buy, if you don't want to spend over $1,000, it's very understandable. You could easily get there by doing things like not doing the RGB on the fans, doing a slightly different case that's a little less expensive, not doing the RGB, and maybe going slightly slower on the RAM. If you went 3200 but still 16 gigs and non-RGB, you could save some money there. You could not do the NVMe and instead do an SSD, or even just an SSD instead of the NVMe and the hard drive. There's also the processor. You could probably go a little lower on for most of what she does and do like a 3400G or a 3300 if you could get it. Or if you can actually find 5th gen, you could do the 5600. And I assume they'll come out with slightly lower end versions of those eventually as well. And again, you could downgrade that graphics card to the 1660 or maybe even the 1650 and not see a huge performance hit, but be under $1,000. And that would be a very usable, good computer for most of what landscape architects do. Wouldn't be quite as quick and snappy, but it should all run pretty well, pretty clean, and for a decent budget. So that's the first in my series of work from home builds, landscape architect edition. So I hope you enjoyed it. By any means, if you have a different profession or games or whatever that you want to know about, comment down below. Subscribe if you want to see the next one so you can see when I do a profession that more closely matches yours. Or if you want to see the other videos I do, like Hardware Demystified, so you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about motherboards. Comment if you're curious about why I made any of the choices here that I didn't explain fully. And at some point down the road, I might do like a Q&A episode where I can run through some of those. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like the look of this. I'm really happy with how it turned out. It's been performing awesome for the last 6-7 months. And I think it looks great personally. Yeah, in the meantime, like, subscribe, comment down below, and stay safe.